Now I'd like to shift us to two populations that are particularly at risk. And the first population, and these do not necessarily represent all of those populations that are at risk. Certainly we just have highlighted two. And one is the population at risk that includes the students with disabilities. If you know anything about the bullying research literature, you would know that in 1992, much of the research in the United States was focused on students with disabilities. And only now, recently, in the last few years, have we begun to become as concerned again. And what do we know? Well, students with disabilities were twice as likely to be identified as perpetrators and victims than students without disabilities. In addition, students with disabilities that are characterized or have diagnostic criteria associated with low social skills or low communication skills have a higher likelihood for involvement. So as the diagnostic criteria includes challenges around interacting with peers and integrating into networks, we see an increased risk for those students. And a 2009 survey of families of children on the autism spectrum found that almost 40% of these students experienced bullying. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to and focus our research endeavors on. Next slide. There was a meta-analysis conducted with children with learning disabilities, and 8 of the 10 children with learning disabilities were peer-rated as rejected. And so we see that the kids that are having academic challenges within the context of our classrooms appear not to be integrated into peer groups. And 8 of 10 were rated as kind of deficient, if you will, in social competence and social problem solving, which may be leading to the further peer rejection that places them at risk for victimization. In addition, these students were less often selected as friends by their peers, and we know from developmental research that as kids are isolated and do not integrate into the peer group, that places them at risk for serious subsequent victimization, especially during early adolescence. Next slide. Now when we look at emotional behavior disorders among students, so these students are 3 to 4 times as likely to be identified as a bully than students without a disability. However, if you look at some of the most recent research that my colleagues and I have been doing, we have to be concerned about how it is that we receive that. It could be that they're engaging in reactive aggression given the social competence challenges that they have. So much more research needs to be conducted on this. Also, students with learning disability who experience comorbid psychiatric diagnosis have reported a significant higher amounts of fear of victimization. So it's not just simply the diagnostic criteria in the label, but it may be those kind of comorbid psychiatric diagnoses that challenge their integration within classrooms and in school communities. And so these children may stand out as targets. So there's a number of concerns that we have around students with disabilities, and I encourage everyone to think about this, but think deeply about how it is that the environments may be contributing to the manifestation of both bullying perpetration and how we can create safe climates in schools for kids to be included so we can prevent victimization over time. The second group, next slide, that I'd like to talk to you about are those LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered, or gender nonconforming youth. And there's been quite a bit of interest in understanding how our schools and school climates may place these students at risk. So what do we know? A large percentage of bullying among students in middle school involves the use of homophobic teasing and slurs. And for the purpose of this webinar, we'll call this homophobic teasing or victimization, and really kind of the use of homophobic epithets. We also know that bullying and homophobic victimization occur more frequently among LGBT youth in American schools than among students who identify as heterosexual. In a recent study, we found 85% of LGBT students reported being verbally harassed, 40% reported being physically assaulted in the past year because of their sexual orientation. So clearly, the research is demonstrating that this is cause for concern. Next slide. In a California study, they found that 7.5% reported being bullied in the last year because they were gay or lesbian or someone thought they were. So clearly the numbers are specific to samples and the data collection method, but we do know that there's a pervasiveness of anti-gay language in schools that suggests that most schools' environments, not all, are hostile for LGBT students and create negative environments for even hetero or straight identified peers. Next slide. In this, I'm presenting some results here of a large study of 7th through 12th graders. And what was nice about this study in some ways is that it started to show some heterogeneity. So as opposed to saying that all LGBT youth have risk profiles, it was true that the findings said that compared to straight-identified youth, LGBT were at greater risk for suicide thoughts, attempts, victimization by their peers, and unexcused absences. But follow-up results actually found that there was different types of risk profiles, that not all LGBT youth reported all of these outcomes. At the same time, it highlighted that even when we considered the victimization that they experienced within the context of school, there were still some disparities for those most at-risk LGBT youth. What does that mean? It means that other things are happening in their life beyond victimization that might be contributing to suicidal thoughts, attempts, victimization. It could be issues around coming out to their family. It could be, the church that they belong to, faith-based organizations, or society in general that's contributing to some of these adverse outcomes. So we have to be very cautious about pointing to just victimization, but recognize that for the majority of LGBT youth, they do experience victimization over time, but if they're placed in supportive school environments where there might be a gay-straight alliance or they come from a family that's accepting, then these kind of adverse outcomes are minimized. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about two at-risk populations, and certainly there are others that we don't have time to discuss, so I apologize if I left out a group and we can ask questions about that. But I want to shift to, and this is a nice transition because when we think about lesbian, gay, and bisexual students' issues within the context of schools, it's not always the sexual orientation. It could be those kids that are gender nonconforming and that they're not fitting into that box. It also could be a result of our schools not being sensitive to different ways of gender expression. And it also could be that there's just an association between bullying, victimization, this homophobic teasing, and what we're going to talk about now is potentially subsequent sexual violence. So I want to take you through a study here where we have followed 5th through 8th graders across 5 ways of data collection, and this is a sample in the Midwest. And there are 3 cohorts, 5th, 6th, and 7th. We followed them over a 2-year period. They included 51% black students identified as blacks and 34% that are identified as white, and 60% of the sample were receiving free and reduced lunch. We gave them self-report measures across spring 2008 and 2010. And given the time that we have, I can't go exactly through the methods, but let me give you some flavor for what these middle school students were reporting as we think about the extent to which bullying is associated with subsequent sexual violence perpetration. When we look at the entire sample of the 1,300 kids, we find that those both males and females that are reporting bullying others at high rates were about 12%. When we look at the extent to which kids are reporting directing homophobic epithets at other students, next slide, we actually find a nice contrast and differential. Here we have a middle school sample, thinking between the ages of 10 and 14, depending, that 34% of the boys reported directing homophobic epithets at other students, whether it's their friends, not their friends, someone they thought was gay, someone they didn't know, someone they didn't even think about being gay. So 34% of them. So you can see that this is, as we have found in the last 10 years of research, homophobic bantering is alive and well, at least within this middle school context in the Midwest of the U.S. For females, they're also contributing to this banter as well. 20% of them are reporting this on a regular basis, and these figures are in the last month that they're engaging in these behaviors. So when we look at the extent to which, next slide, on the ground rape prevention educators are engaging in bullying prevention because it's much more palatable for principals and superintendents to have someone come in and say, well, I'm going to help you with your bullying problem. But yet we know that homophobic bantering and even sexual harassment is quite prevalent in our schools. Will those bullying prevention programs that might be garden variety, that do not talk about gender nonconformity or they do not talk about sexual orientation as being a target, will they be effective? Well, I think the jury is still out on that, but this particular paper that we published here is clearly showing a connection longitudinally between those kids that perpetrate bullying, here where it's defined as name-calling, rumor spreading, and some threats of harm. is associated with sexual harassment perpetration over that 2-year period. Now, sexual harassment perpetration within the context of middle school, we're not talking about rape or sexual assault. We're talking about a lot of commentary